Hello and welcome to another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. I'm Jamie Johnson, the legal and government correspondent. And as you know, coming up this spring, we have spring statewide elections, even a presidential primary election. And our guest today is a candidate for one of those positions. It is a Supreme Court Justice for Wisconsin, and the candidate is Ed Falone. Ed, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jamie.
It's great to have you here, and we're having three candidates. Hopefully, get all three on the show. Mm-hmm. We've had one interview, one more to go. We'll probably follow the similar format. Have you talk a little bit about your background, education, experience, mm-hmm. and then get into other things about why you're running.
Sure.
So I'll let you start with what's your background.
Right. I'm happy to be here on the show, happy to be in Hudson again. Well, my background, as I tell folks, I'm a very proud child of a Mexican immigrant and a public school teacher. My father, when he was in teacher's college, as a young man, went to Mexico City on a college trip where he met my mother, and they corresponded by letter, which many of your viewers probably don't remember letters, but they did. They corresponded by letters after he returned to the United States, and then he went back to Mexico and they got married. And so I was one of four children they raised in the state of Maryland. Typical single family worker household. Money was not in abundance, but I was able to go to college on a scholarship and got my undergrad and law degree at Boston University, one of the best law schools in the country. And then I practiced law for corporate clients at a very high level at a national law firm based out of Washington. And I was representing corporate clients in $350 million civil fraud suits, white-collar crime defense, and major FBI investigations. And after about 4 years of that, I realized that wasn't how I wanted to spend my life. And so my wife Heidi and I talked, and we moved to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 1992. And so for 27 years, I've been on the faculty at Marquette Law School, and I teach constitutional law, corporate law, and criminal law. And over the years, I've trained over 2,300 members of the Wisconsin Bar.
Wow. And so any children?
Yeah, two children. A daughter, Emma, who is 26, living in New York City, and son Andrew, who is 22, who's currently doing a year-long fellowship in Germany. He's finished his college and trying to figure out what he wants to do with his career.
Well, that's where a lot of us that have 20-year-old somethings are at that stage, but that's great. Mm-hmm. So you live down in the Milwaukee area then?
Yeah, I live in the city of Milwaukee with my wife Heidi, and I've been very active my whole career in Milwaukee and southeastern Wisconsin in the nonprofit sector. So for 2 decades I've led nonprofit organizations, mostly related to access to justice, helping to provide low-cost lawyers to people who have civil cases, whether it's family law, they need a divorce, or they're sued for unpaid hospital bills, or immigrant families who are in deportation and have claims of political asylum, or that if they're returned home, there's an abusive spouse waiting. So I've been very concerned my whole career with trying to provide affordable lawyers to people so they don't have to go to court on their own. And that's something that I've been very passionate about as well in my career.
Okay. And any political experience, partisan politics, anything like that?
No, I've never been active in a partisan way. I've really focused my attentions and my efforts on serving the community and the needs of the community. So whether it's volunteering and leading organizations like I described that provide low-cost lawyers, or as president of the Latino Community Center that intervened with at-risk youth, try and keep them from getting into gang activity, or just being active in the local Hispanic community. As a child of a Mexican immigrant, I've always treasured my Hispanic heritage and have been very active in the community that way. Never thought to run for political office. I really feel that what I can offer is my expertise as a constitutional law expert, my qualifications as a lawyer, a litigator in federal court at a high level, and my understanding of the challenges working families have in our legal system, and how often we have two kinds of justice. The justice, if you have resources, you can expend them for the best, and the justice you get when you don't have resources and you have to go to court on your own. And so from my perspective, really the best way I can serve, not just as a volunteer, but the broader public, has always been to serve on our Supreme Court.
The students you teach, and you mentioned the subject areas, is that all generally first year?
I teach throughout the curriculum at the law school. Okay. And very proud to say that many of my former students are now judges, prosecutors, elected officials. I think Governor Evers, the last 4 appointments he's made to the bench, I think, were former students of mine. In our state legislature, I'm very proud to say that Representative Evan Goyke is a former student of mine. He's endorsed my campaign. And so I have students who are really community leaders all over the state, and I'm very proud of that fact.
Okay. And you mentioned about having the experience in the federal system and so forth. Yeah. Since coming to Wisconsin, have you had opportunity to be involved in litigation in the Wisconsin circuit court system or the appellate system?
Yes. One thing I've done is for over 8 years, I was of counsel at a law firm in Milwaukee called Gonzalez, Sahio, and Harlan, one of the largest, at that time, one of the largest minority-owned law firms in the country, and representing clients in business litigation, shareholder disputes, mostly family businesses where there was a falling out. And so I did that for about 8 years. One of the things about being a full-time law professor is that there are limitations on how much time you can spend on outside compensated legal work. Right. And so I had to stay within those guidelines and sort of limit my practice. And I've also been expert witness in several high-profile cases where one of the parties hired me as an expert to explain complicated areas of business law.
Business law, then, is where you would say you would be hired as an expert, then?
My expert witness work has been in business law, not so much call for criminal law expertise as an expert. Right. Yeah. And my constitutional law experience has been really at a different level, but I certainly have been advising elected officials. I'm very proud of the fact that, for example, I advised Senator Herb Kohl on 4 United States Supreme Court nominations. Okay. So I helped him prepare for the confirmation hearings of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Stephen Breyer, Sonia Sotomayor, and Elena Kagan. And also, I was approached by the Obama White House when the Merrick Garland nomination was being obstructed by Mitch McConnell in the Senate. The Obama White House Office of Communications asked me to be one of 3 law professors in the country to speak out at a national press conference and explain why the Senate obstruction was unconstitutional. So I have provided my advice to many senior and national officials as well.
Okay. Now, I asked you about whether you've run for partisan political office before, but you have run for office before. In fact, you've run for the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Yeah. And that was in 2013?
That's right. I ran for the court in 2013. I had people in the community approach me and ask me to run. At that time, the incumbent up for re-election was Patience Rogensack. And so I ran, and I think it was a quite successful campaign. Even though I did not succeed, I came in second. Yeah. I got more newspaper endorsements than the incumbent, and I received over 360,000 votes statewide. So I saw that as a successful campaign, and I learned a lot. I learned a lot about what it takes to run statewide in Wisconsin, and it was a very valuable experience.
Because you did finish second, I mean, what are your thoughts in getting in a race again, and now there's 3 candidates, so there's going to be a primary. How do you see that impacting the race? Yeah.
Well, I think, first of all, I think I've the benefit of having run before is people around the state of Wisconsin know who I am, especially in this part of the state, in Hudson, Eau Claire. Many people remember my run, and they're coming up and they're thanking me for running again. So I do have benefits from having run. I think that what I learned from running before was that I have to talk about my qualifications, and I have to talk about my principles and my values, and that in these judicial races, voters really want to know, where you stand and what you believe in. And I think in 2013, I was talking about a state Supreme Court that was becoming too partisan, too divided, dysfunctional.
Have you seen that change at all?
It's gotten worse. It's gotten worse. We have a court where it's almost as if when you read their opinions, you have, 5 justice majority, a 2 justice minority. It's like they're not even talking to each other. It's as if it's not even the same case. So I was warning about the court headed in a more partisan direction. I think maybe in 2013, some of the voters didn't appreciate that yet. But I think if you ask now around the state in 2019, I think anyone you talk to will say, yes, our state Supreme Court has become bitterly partisan, and we need to get back to the independent kind of court we used to have.
And so have you heard that as a campaign, in response to your campaign? I mean, in the course of going around the state, heard people
Jamie,
say this?
People don't want to see our judicial elections run the same way as our partisan congressional races. They don't want to see judges running attack ads against each other. They don't want to see judges hurling personal attacks. They want to see a race for the state Supreme Court in particular, given the importance it plays in deciding our rights. They want to see races run on qualifications. People pointing to, here's my legal experience, here's my education. That's how they want to choose who our justices are, not based on attack ads.
Well, one of the problems that I've seen, and it goes all the way back to the 90s, when I ran for office in the mid-90s, was independent groups starting to do expenditures, especially when we were trying to introduce campaign reform and so forth, and the ability to get some public money, had to agree to certain limitations and whatnot, but then people started skirting around that by, with the independent groups. And the problem with the independent groups is that they do their ads and they spend their money without consulting the candidate, because otherwise they wouldn't be independent. So did you see that happen in your 2013 race, and do you see it happening?
I think in 2013, there was not a lot of independent money spent. I fully expect this to be very different. But from my perspective, and as you indicate, there's no way really to control what these outside groups say. You almost, as a candidate, have no control over your own campaign. But from my perspective, they can't define me if I've already defined myself. And I've got a 30-year career. I mean, the people of Wisconsin know who Ed Falone is. I've been speaking out. I've been on Wisconsin Public Radio talking about legal issues. I've been interviewed by statewide media on countless topics. And in particular, I've spoken out when I saw, for example, Governor Walker trying to charge fees to anyone who tried to protest at the state capitol. I wrote an opinion piece in the newspaper. I said, you can't put a price tag on the First Amendment. Many media outlets agreed with me because they quoted me in their editorials opposing that. I spoke out against the legislation that gave special favors for Foxconn in order to attract them. I said we shouldn't have special rules for special people in our justice system. It should be the same rules for everyone. So I think because I'm a known quantity, the people of Wisconsin know who I am and what I stand for. I'm not worried about having outside money come and try to scare them about me.
Okay. Now, you mentioned, the idea of equal justice and so forth, the recusal. That's become an issue where every person who, whether they're appointed to the bench and then win retaining election, or they're elected to the bench, they all come with pre-justice backgrounds. And do you feel that there's been sufficient recusal, or do you see that as an area that needs some better enforcement?
Well, here you've hit on it. I mean, this is an issue I talked about in 2013. So in another sense, this is an example of where maybe I was ahead of the curve talking about something before a lot of people in the state recognized how important it was. Right now, what we have is a rule at the state Supreme Court that says judges are not required to recuse themselves or step down from hearing a case just because a party to the case gave them major campaign contributions. And obviously, I think that that's outrageous, and I said so in 2013, and I've been saying so since. I've been speaking out, calling for reform and change consistently, working with Common Cause Wisconsin, and doing public speaking, even appearing in a video, trying to educate the public about this after my last race. And it's simple fairness. If I'm in a case and the opposing party gave major campaign contributions to the judge, and then I lose, and I walk out of the courtroom, I have no way of knowing whether I lost on the merits or whether I lost because the judge was favoring the other side.
And when you say major, what would be your dividing line? Because obviously somebody that gives $10 to a campaign is not necessarily going to be buying much favor with a contribution like that. But would you have a dollar limit?
Well, absolutely. And there was a proposal by a group of retired judges who got together and they mapped out a proposal. Here's a model rule. And it had a sliding scale of dollar amounts that would require recusal, starting at the circuit court or trial court, then going to the Court of Appeals. And the number for the state Supreme Court would be if a party in the case gave you more than $10,000 to your campaign within a couple years of you running, you should step down. Now, as a candidate who ran before and is running now, I can tell you there are very, very few contributors at that $10,000 level.
Right.
So we're really not talking about requiring recusal very often. We're talking about the very small number of big donors and just telling them, you can elect whoever you want to the court. You just can't guarantee they're going to be sitting there deciding cases you're a part of. And I think that's simple fairness.
Well, and I think I probably read it in a John Grisham novel, but I think that was the premise of one of his books, was because at the Supreme Court level, you can anticipate if there's a case that you know is going to be controversial, and that could be a corporation, and I don't want to name names, but a corporation that's challenging, for instance, an environmental regulation.
Yes.
And they're thinking about putting it into suit. It's going to be 2.5 years before that gets up, a good 2.5 years before it gets to the Supreme Court.
Yes.
So you could be funding candidates maybe on both sides, or putting your money in, so that, and corporations sometimes do that.
Absolutely.
They contribute to both sides.
Jamie, I represented these corporations in practice. I know they have political strategies years in advance in order to elect both, congressional seats to people who favor them, but also judicial candidates. It's absolutely how they operate. And we've seen examples in other states, such as West Virginia, where a party, a polluter, made major campaign contributions to elect someone who ended up being the crucial vote in their favor in a case. And I don't think in Wisconsin we need to wait for a scandal like that. I think it's just common sense. We should just change the rules. There's no harm. No one has a right to say, I want that judge. You can elect anyone you want, but you don't have a right to say, that's the judge I want on my case.
Right. And so what do you see in particular about Wisconsin justice system in your experience, in academia? You get to analyze these things, but what do you see as trends that you think you might be able to have an impact if you're elected as a justice?
Well, I think, I bring a diverse perspective to the court, and I think that that's really important. We sometimes try to talk about, judicial elections as if there's some model judge, some kind of perfect resume that, if we had 7 people with that exact resume, that would be a great thing. And I'm here to tell you, we already have 3 justices who are former prosecutors, and then we're a trial judge, and now they're on the state Supreme Court. 3 of our 7 justices have that background. We don't need a 4th. What we need is a different range of legal experience. I mean, the law is more than just criminal trials. You have civil litigation, right? You've got business law. You've got family law. And the Supreme Court issues decisions that are so important to all of these areas. You also have constitutional law. They're deciding our constitutional rights. So my campaign is premised on the idea, let's have at least one member of our court who's a constitutional law professor, who's a criminal defense lawyer, not from the prosecutor side. We haven't had one of those since Louis Butler lost his re-election over 10 years ago. And someone who's actually worked alongside working families and our immigrant communities, and who understands the challenges they face in our legal system. There's got to be room for that voice on our court. And then I just tell people in the campaign, who was, in my view, the best justice in our state Supreme Court in our state's history. Someone who was a law professor, had never been a trial judge, and gave us 4 decades of leadership and courage and defense of our civil rights, which is Justice Shirley Abramson, who just recently retired. And so I feel we need to replace her voice and her perspective. We need a broader set of experiences represented in the court. And I think when that happens, when more judges with different perspectives are on the court, then you have justice, right? And in addition to that, I'd be the first Latino on our state Supreme Court, and I think it's important that judges reflect our state's population as well.
People are, curious, why somebody runs for statewide office. You've explained that, but what is part of that process? Obviously, you're here in studio, getting around the state.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about what that's like.
Well, I'm a firm believer. I need to go to as many parts of the state as I can. I need to talk to local residents. I need to ask them, what are your local concerns? And I can tell you, I do that, and it's amazing to me how common our concerns are around the state when it comes to the legal system and what's happening. People are very concerned about the quality of their drinking water, whether it's in Kewaunee County up in the northeast or if it's in Grant County in the southwest. People are very concerned about drinking water quality and if local communities even have the power to regulate and control runoff from these corporate farms. That's a common concern. People are very concerned about public financing of our schools and how are we paying for public education and whether local communities have any ability to decide how to fund their public schools or whether their say is taken away from them. And a lot of these issues, it's our state Supreme Court who ultimately decides, is the decision going to be made at the local level? Is the decision going to be made in the state capitol, in the state legislature? Or sometimes our state Supreme Court decides the decision isn't even an option. Our state constitution has taken this off the table. So it's an important body.
One of those statewide issues and one that kind of intersects with the judiciary because, well, the general election for this Supreme Court justice is going to be the same day as and in the same election as our presidential primary.
Yeah.
And one of the big issues that saw work its way through the courts and up to the Supreme Court was redistricting.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Wisconsin was one of the leading cases that went. What do you see and what have you seen in that arena that you think we need to avoid repeating?
Well, that's a good question. I'll tell you this. Gerrymandered legislative districts are a real concern around the state. People are upset. And right now, this is the time when all candidates have their nomination papers out and they're getting signatures. And so as I go around the state to events, I listen to the local candidates. And as they're getting signatures, they're saying these outrageous things like, well, if you're to the east of Broad Street, you're in my district, but if you're across Broad Street, you're not. Or if you're north of the high school, you are, but if you're south, you're not. And you can really see this gerrymandering and its effects right before your eyes as these people have to try to explain who's in my district and who isn't, and people don't even know because it's so convoluted. I think it's obvious that after the census, we're going to get new district maps drawn up.
Right.
And I think it's obvious that after that happens, there's going to be litigation. They're going to be challenged in the Wisconsin courts. And that question of whether those maps violate our First Amendment rights, whether they violate our equal protection rights, is going to go to the Wisconsin Supreme Court. It's clear. Now, I plan on being there in the court, and so I'm not expressing any view one side or the other as to how I would approach that decision. I'm going to listen open to both sides, but I can tell you this, as a constitutional law professor, I have long said our Constitution's job is to defend our ability to govern ourselves, to have us have a voice in the making of the laws that we live under. And so that's my starting premise. And so that's the approach I'll take as I decide that case.
Aside, not trying to indicate how you would decide one way or the other, but what is your feeling on the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling on that? Their solution was, we're not going to deal with it, and if it's partisan, it needs to be decided in another arena.
Yeah, I'm a very strong critic of the U.S. Supreme Court decision where they essentially said federal courts cannot hear challenges to gerrymandered maps. Their rationale was we don't know the difference between a map that's kind of gerrymandered and a map that's too gerrymandered. And they said, if we don't know how to draw the line, then federal courts should just stay out of this, is essentially. But I can tell you, there were plenty of tests, objective tests, that were presented. They had multiple tests they could have chosen that would have distinguished between maps that were slightly partisan versus maps that were just outrageously partisan. They just didn't choose one of those tests. So it wasn't as if they had no way to tell the difference, it's just they decided they didn't want to tell the difference.
So it wouldn't have to be, and I'm blanking on the justice's name, but nearly 100 years ago when there was a case involving pornography and the justices were struggling with defining it, and they say, I can't tell you what it is, but I know it when I see it.
No, not at all. There are actually some very basic statistical models, just using math, that can tell you, for example, looking at the way the map is drawn, that there's a 99% probability that it was drawn based on partisan political lines. I even had high school students explain to me the various formulas. It was actually interesting to me that a group of high school students had taken on as a project to look at these.
They could do it, but our U.S. Supreme Court justices
They absolutely could. They explained it to me, I understood it perfectly, but apparently our U.S. Supreme Court couldn't.
Okay. What impact does this have on your work schedule going around the state like this? Are you done with the fall semester, or?
I have finished the fall semester, thank you for caring. I've been teaching full-time, normal course load at Marquette Law School, and still campaigning across the state, which is a challenge, but the semester is now done, so I have my stack of exams and my stack of research papers to grade. And then in the spring semester, starting in January, I plan on teaching part-time. So I'll just teach my constitutional law class, and that'll give me a little more time to get around the state.
I am curious because you're now in the 7th Congressional District, sitting here with this interview in St. Croix County, and we've been sitting for, I think, a couple months now with no representation in Washington because Sean Duffy resigned and didn't stay there until someone else could take his place. Yeah. And there was a little bit of political posturing with the dates for when the elections and the primary and so forth. So have you been in the 7th much to see what voters are saying about that? Because it has a slight impact because at least one of those elections will coincide with, I guess, your primary.
That's right, that's right. Well, I know people are very concerned about the lack of representation, and there was a lot of concern about when the date of the primary would be and when the special election would be, because obviously you don't want to go a long period of time without representation.
But I think it was a problem with the state law coinciding with the federal law and so forth.
Yeah, and maybe the problem is, I don't know if it's a problem, but maybe it's just that we have a lot of elections in Wisconsin, and so scheduling in a special election can be a challenge. This is my first trip through the 7th District on this campaign. I spent yesterday in Eau Claire County, today in Hudson. I do plan on coming back. This is a part of the state that is very important to me, and it's also a part of the state, quite frankly, that I feel very fondly towards, because when I ran in 2013, I got a great deal of support up here in Hudson and in Eau Claire. So it's great to be back. It's been a couple years. I'm enjoying seeing old friends, having people come up and say, I was for you in 2013, I'm for you again. As a candidate, that's the greatest thing you can hear.
That's great. Now, we're talking about the campaign, and we haven't mentioned the website. What website do you have?
The website for my campaign is falloneforjustice.com. So F-A-L-L-O-N-E, the word for, F-O-R, justice.com.
So all one word.
All one word, no dots, easy to find.
And the Fallone, just remember the E because it's silent.
There you go. Remember the E. It's like Stallone.
There you go.
Any resemblance is coincidental.
Okay, and the final thing about that website, I noticed you have a tab on writings. Yeah. Can you tell us briefly why you did that?
Yeah, I am always a believer in transparency in government and transparency of candidates. I think people have a right to know who they're voting for and what they stand for. And so since I do have a 30-year career of speaking out on issues related to constitutional rights, civil rights, all sorts of issues of good government, I figured let's put everything I've written on the campaign webpage and people can read for themselves. So it's very easy. You go to falloneforjustice.com, you click on writings, and you have page after page. If you want, if you have the time, you can see my position on the John Doe investigation, on Act 10, on the Trump Muslim ban. It's all right there, and people will know exactly who they're voting for February 18th in the primary.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you, Ed, for being on the show. Ed Fallone, running for Supreme Court Justice in Wisconsin. And thank you for watching another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. I'm Jamie Johnson. Keep watching. Hello and welcome to another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. I'm Jamie Johnson, and today we have one of the candidates for Supreme Court Justice, Jill Karofsky. Did I say that correctly?
Perfect.
All right. You actually have a website, it's Jill for Justice, and I know you are a judge currently, but do you mind if I refer to you first name?
No, go right ahead, please.
Very good. Judge, would you mind telling our viewers a little bit about yourself? I guess I should also introduce the fact that there is a Supreme Court election in early April. It'll be the same election in which the presidential primary is. And we also have then a primary because we have 3 candidates who have submitted nomination papers sufficient to force the primary. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yep, there'll be a primary on February 18th, and the general election is going to be April 7th.
All right. Thank you for those specific dates. And Judge Jill is our first of 3 candidates that we are interviewing, and she's remote from her home in Madison, Wisconsin, where she is currently a judge at the circuit court level. So again, Jill, if you don't mind telling the viewers a little bit about yourself and your background, maybe starting with a family or whatever, but I want to take the experience, probably chop that up into, because you've got a long list here of things that you've been involved in. So, all right?
All right. Yeah, well, thank you so much, and thank you for allowing me to interview via Zoom or Skype. I am a sitting judge right now in Dane County, and I have a very, very busy court calendar. I heard over 1,700 cases just last year, and so I appreciate the opportunity. I was in court today, so I wasn't able to make it up there. So thanks for the opportunity and thanks for understanding. Look, I'm running for the Wisconsin Supreme Court because we have got to get this court back on track. I have been traveling all around Wisconsin the past several months, and I hear the same thing from voters. What they see are justices who act like politicians. They make decisions before anyone ever walks into the state Supreme Court chamber. They don't follow the rule of law. And that feels like corruption to people. So what I'm bringing to this race are my experience, my Wisconsin values, and my energy. And you have asked about my experience. So I will tell you that I am the only person in this race who is or who has ever been a trial court judge. And that is hugely important because I'm in court every day. I see how the law impacts real people. I know how important it is to apply the law equally and fairly. And when we apply the Constitution, to do it with today in mind. It is 2020. I also know that, hold on. I have a golden retriever here and I have to give her a treat or she's gonna be barking at me, so I apologize.
That's all right.
I also know that when people come into my courtroom, they are dealing with real problems. It is not an esoteric exercise when people come in and they are a victim of crime, or their property is being divided in a divorce, or they are dealing with eviction issues. And when you're in the courtroom all the time, you see how that impacts people. I'm also the only person in this race who has spent years as a prosecutor. I know how important it is to treat everyone with the fairness and dignity and respect that I would want to be treated with. I understand the importance of individual rights when it comes to victims, when it comes to witnesses, when it comes to defendants, and when it comes to the public. I know how important it is to be smart on crime. I have experience as a civil attorney as well. I was the general counsel for a national organization where I practiced employment law and copyright law and managed huge, huge contracts. I've been a victim advocate. I was the state's first violence against women resource prosecutor, and then I was the head of the state's Office of Crime Victim Services. I worked in every single county of this state to make sure that victims' rights were honored, to make sure that victims had the help that they needed while their case was winding through the criminal justice system. And I've also been a law professor. I've been a professor at Wisconsin's only public law school, the University of Wisconsin Law School, where I taught trial advocacy, and I taught a class that I created on victims in the criminal justice system. So when people graduated from law school, they would know right away how to help people who oftentimes have little or no voice in our justice system. So I'm the candidate in this race who has been on the front lines of our justice system for almost 3 decades.
All right, let's back up a little bit. Your bio mentions that you have children. Are they in Wisconsin?
I do. I have 2 teenagers. I'm the single mom of 2 teenagers. My daughter right now is in Tucson, Arizona, where it's almost, I would say a good 80 degrees warmer than it is where we are here. And my son is a sophomore in high school.
Okay. And you also mentioned your golden retriever, and that's who viewers might hear in the background, but it was dinner time, and so you're down in the kitchen area, I suppose, in your home.
I am, yeah. So I do apologize for that. I have a 11-and-a-half-year-old one-eyed golden retriever named Cleo, who at this time of day, for anyone who's a pet owner, knows that this is when they need the most attention.
Absolutely. Yep. Well, Mom just got home from work, so, right?
Exactly.
Well, you mentioned your experience as a prosecutor, and before that, you got your master's degree and law degree from Madison. Is that correct? Is that right?
I did.
Okay.
Yes.
And then out of law school, where did you go?
Immediately after law school, I worked in the Dane County District Attorney's Office. I was an assistant district attorney, and then after a couple of years, I was promoted to deputy district attorney. And I handled cases, all kinds of different cases, but I really specialized in cases where women and children were victims of crime: sexual assault, domestic violence, child abuse, and child sexual assault.
Yes.
And I worked really hard to make sure that those victims had a voice in the system, and that the people who harmed them were held accountable for what.
How long were you in the Dane County DA's office?
Almost 10 years.
Okay. And then from there, is that when you went into be the civil attorney for the national organization?
Yes, then I went to the National Conference of Bar Examiners, which is the organization that writes the bar exam, that makes sure that people who practice law all around the country are qualified, have the minimum competence to be able to practice law in whichever state they're practicing in.
Okay. And so you're a little younger than me, but can remember when the domestic abuse statute was first introduced and kind of tried to level the scales, so to speak, so that the victims had more of a, speak about, a little bit more about your work as a victim advocate, please.
Sure. So I have been working with victims of crime since I was in law school. And I started out as an assistant when I was in the Dane County District Attorney's Office. Initially, I had a caseload that had a lot of domestic violence cases, like you're talking about. I think one of the statutes you're talking about was Wisconsin's mandatory arrest law. Also, Wisconsin, of course, was the first state in the country to pass a Bill of Rights for victims. We've really been on the forefront when it's come to victims' rights in this state. So I worked with many, many victims of crime in the DA's office. I created a class at the University of Wisconsin Law School, as I mentioned, called Victims in the Criminal Justice System. Really proud about my work in that class. There are only 3 or 4 law schools in the entire country that have a class devoted only to crime victims. I also was the state's first violence against women resource prosecutor. I was an assistant attorney general at the Wisconsin Department of Justice. And in that role, I helped prosecutors all around the state learn how to prosecute cases of domestic violence, of sexual assault, and of stalking. And then I became the head of the Office of Crime Victim Services for the state, also at the Department of Justice. And in that role, we help victims in every county of Wisconsin get the services that they needed, the compensation that they needed through the Crime Victims Compensation Program, make sure that their rights were protected as they went through the criminal justice system, that they got the notice that they should have, that they were able to be at court, that their voices were heard, that they were treated with the fairness, the respect, and the dignity that all crime victims and everyone in the justice system should be treated with.
So thank you. That was an excellent summary. And so your experience is not just there in Dane County, even though that's where you've been judged for almost 3 years now. You really do have statewide exposure in those areas.
Absolutely. I traveled around the state every week when I was at the head of the Office of Crime Victim Services and when I was the Violence Against Women Resource Prosecutor. Helped many people throughout Wisconsin. We were responsible for grants that went to every county to make sure that people had the sexual assault services, victim services, for example, that they needed, made sure that every county that had a rape crisis center, that they had the funds, make sure that people had access when they were sexual assault victims to the sexual assault nurse examiner exam, or the forensic exam as we now call it. We did a lot of work with victims, made sure that their privacy rights were protected. I worked on the Supreme Court rule, the reason that you don't see a victim's name ever anymore in a Court of Appeals decision or a Supreme Court decision was because of the work that I started to keep victims' names out of those decisions so we could protect their privacy.
Okay. Well, and this is more of a process or a procedural question, but how do you run then a statewide campaign as a sitting and active judge with the primary coming up in roughly 9 weeks?
Yeah, so you get around the state, you talk to as many people as you possibly can. I have, like I said, a very, very busy court calendar. I'm in court every morning at about 8 o'clock, and I don't get out until 4:30 or 5, and then I campaign in the evenings, and I campaign on the weekends. And one of the things that I'm bringing to this race is my energy. I was the state high school tennis champion in Wisconsin. I was a Division I athlete in track and in cross country. I finished the Ironman triathlon 2 times. I now run 50-mile ultra marathons. I ran a race just in August. I started in Belleville and ran south of Monroe back to Belleville. It was 50 miles. I did it in just over 11 hours. I have never been outworked, and I have never been out hustled. And there's just no way anyone's going to outwork or out hustle me in this race. Just to give you an example of one of our weekends, I took, after work on a Friday, I drove up all the way up to Ashland, late on a Friday night, slept very, very quickly, woke up on Saturday morning, ran the entire Whistle Stop Marathon, then went up to an event in Washburn, got up the next day, went to Merrill, went to Green Bay, got home at 9 o'clock, and I was on the bench the next morning at 8 o'clock in the morning, ready to go again. And so that's the kind of energy that I am bringing to this race, and the kind of energy that I'm going to bring to the Wisconsin Supreme Court.
That's awesome. It is a large state, and I didn't know that you were at Whistle Stop this year?
Yeah. Have you run it?
I run the half. I've done the half for about 10 years there. So.
Oh, so you're up there this year?
Yes.
It was cold and windy.
It was very cold. It was very cold. But
yeah, I loved it. I've done that race before, and
it's beautiful.
I love it.
Yes. So, well, that's great. Now, talk about, you mentioned values. And again, talking about how, and good or bad, I think it is more bad for our judiciary. We want to hear folks being more nonpartisan, neutral, less partisanship, left, right, end of the spectrum type of thing. And Wisconsin has gotten a national reputation for money coming in from out of state and huge money coming into these races. What do you bring to the table to try and stop that, if you will, or bring it to an end, or change the focus from partisanship to one more about justice?
Right. So I have a couple answers to that question. One is what we need in this state is a really clear recusal rule. There needs to be a bright line, and that bright line needs to be a line that everyone is going to follow. And it is incumbent on the Supreme Court to pass a strong recusal rule so that when money comes into these elections, that if money comes in above where that line is, that a justice will not, or a judge will not hear that case. And the recusal rule needs to go all the way through the court system, the Supreme Court, Court of Appeals, and to the Circuit Court. The problem is that our Supreme Court has failed to promulgate that rule. There is no rule. I would love to have a rule. I would follow that rule if we had it. I would follow it happily because I'd be so happy that we have a rule. So that's the first thing. We've got to have a strong recusal rule. As far as the values that I'm bringing to this race, I am born and raised in Wisconsin. I'm bringing my strong Wisconsin values to this race. I was born and raised in South Central Wisconsin. When I grew up, my mom was mayor of my city as I was growing up. And I watched her do things like bring emergency medical service into my town. I saw her bring buses in so people had access to public transportation. I was so proud of my mom. The first time I walked into a courtroom, it was to change my middle name to hers. So I would have her name. My dad was a local pediatrician. And the first thing my dad did when he retired was open a free clinic for teenagers because he knew that they wouldn't have access to health care unless there was an opportunity for them to get health care for free. So my parents taught me how important public service is, how important serving your community is, how you need to use whatever gifts you have to stand up and lean in when people around you are in need. And now I'm the head of my own house, right? I'm the single mom of 2 teenagers. My kids and I all went to public school. I talk to my kids about the importance of women's rights and workers' rights and human rights and civil rights. And when I talk to my kids about being in this race and ask them what they are concerned about, they are concerned about going to school for code red drills. They want to go to school to learn, not to do these code red drills that they have to do. They're worried about gun violence. My kids are worried about the climate crisis. My kids see corruption on the state level. They see corruption on the federal level. And they want the grown-ups in the room to do something about it. And it's the least that we can do for our kids is to stand up and to tackle these problems on their behalf. So those are the values that I am bringing to this race.
Very good. You mentioned about the, corruption and about a recusal rule. Have you seen or heard of instances where maybe some of the people recently on the Supreme Court, I won't say currently, but recently on the Supreme Court, have heard cases that they probably should not have heard because of either campaign donations or other prior involvements?
Absolutely. I've seen it. And yes, I have absolutely seen it. And the public has seen it too. The voters see it too. They feel like there is corruption on our Supreme Court. And what really worries people and what should worry people is this, is think about the cases. Look, this race is so important. These elections have incredible consequences. Think about the cases that our Supreme Court is going to hear in the next several years. They most certainly are going to hear a case on redistricting because we'll have a new census next year, and after that, the legislative lines will be redrawn. And there is, a very, very great likelihood that that is going to will evolve into a case that will end up at the Supreme Court.
And why is that, if I can stop you there, on the redistricting, because that is pretty important. Why wasn't that solved with our last census and redistricting? Was there a passing of the buck there? Because I thought it went to the U.S. Supreme Court.
It did go up to the it did go up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and then they kicked it back to they kicked it back, and they said that there wasn't standing in each of the individual counties. And then at the very end of the last session in June of last year, the U.S. Supreme Court said, if the districts that are drawn, if there's litigation on those because they are drawn on because of partisan lines, then we, the U.S. Supreme Court, aren't going to hear those. We want the state Supreme Court to hear those.
So that's why you're saying it'll be back in Wisconsin State Supreme Court.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And so who's making the decisions about our legislative lines matters. I believe our Supreme Court is going to hear cases about how we're going to keep our air and our water clean, and who we have making those decisions matters. Our Supreme Court is going to hear cases about, probably criminal justice reform, about Wisconsin's answer to the climate crisis. What's democracy in this state going to look like? All of those huge issues that are going to impact Wisconsin today and for years into the future are decided by individuals on the state Supreme Court. And so who we have up there makes a huge, huge difference. And what voters feel like is that there are justices on the Supreme Court who don't follow the rule of law, who make decisions before anyone ever walks into the state Supreme Court chamber, who act like politicians. And that feels like corruption to people. And that worries people because they know how important who sits on our Supreme Court is. Not to mention that these terms are 10 years long. So once you are on the court, you are there for a very, very long time.
Okay. And, well, we've talked about your different, and you mentioned the energy thing, so we got in the marathon running and so forth. I wanted to talk a little bit about your awards. I know that it's not something that most judges tend to be a little bit more humble about doing that. They're not doing it for the sake of getting awards, but yours go back to a time before you were a judge too. So can you talk a little bit about the awards that you won from the Victim Witness Professional Association, the Sexual Assault Voices of Courage, and the Domestic Violence Award?
Sure. So I won award. I won the Professional of the Year award from the Wisconsin Victim Witness Association. I was very proud to earn that award after working years and years with the victim witness professionals around the state of Wisconsin, who I have to say are the unsung heroes of our criminal justice system. They help so many people every single day. And I was really honored to receive an award from a group of people who I hold in such incredibly high esteem. I also did win an award, the Voices of Courage Award from the Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault. I won that award for the work I did on the Attorney General's Sexual Assault Response Team. And one of the things I did on that team was to identify the problem of untested sexual assault kits in Wisconsin, and then make sure that we got the resources that we needed to be able to test those kits so that crime victims could see justice. I won an award from a local in Dane County domestic violence organization, our community coordinated community response team here, for the work that I have done for decades when it's come to domestic violence, to try to keep victims of domestic violence safe, to keep women safe, to keep children safe, to keep people in need safe from violence in their own homes, which is the place where all of us should be the most safe. And when people end up being hurt in the sanctity of their own homes, that is, they don't have any place to go. So to make sure that they are helped in the criminal justice system is something that I spent much of my career doing.
All right, and we mentioned towards the beginning, and I'll repeat it, and probably will again, that you have a website. People need more information about you, your background. It's jillforjustice.com.
We do, yep, jillforjustice.com. We also have a Facebook page. We have a Twitter page. We have Instagram, because my kid said you need an Instagram page. So we have an Instagram page as well with some wonderful pictures on it. And it would be great if people would join us in this campaign, and if they would get on those pages and they can see what this campaign is all about and learn more about it.
All right, but on that page, which I printed on the About Jill for Justice, is it goes on for 2 pages, the various task forces, coalitions, committees that you've been on, and not mentioning every board or council, but what are some of the ones that stand out with maybe you've had the greatest impact or the longest impact working on?
No, a lot of those boards I served on, each one of them is so special. I sat on the Wisconsin Child Death Review Task Force, which was a task force trying to figure out when we lose children in this state, why, and are there trends, and are there ways that we can educate people. I sat on the Wisconsin, the Children's Trust Fund board, which worked to try to figure out how we help kids who are abused and who are neglected in this state. As I mentioned, I did work on the Attorney General's Sexual Assault Response Team. I was one of the co-chairs of that team. I served on the Governor's Council against domestic abuse. Again, making sure that we had statewide policies to help domestic abuse victims. I also sat on the state's, the Crime Victims Council, which help crime victims all across the state. I've done lots and lots of work when it comes to the Violence Against Women Act. When I was the head of the Office of Crime Victim Services, one of the jobs I had was to oversee the Violence Against Women Act money that came into Wisconsin, to make sure that we could help as many people as possible with the money that we received. So in each of those, I was able to help people, women and children and people in need who truly needed the help. And I learned so much from the other people I served with on those committees, because they were all filled with people who had incredible expertise from around Wisconsin, and people who were really very, very devoted and committed to helping others.
I noticed too that you have had experience before you had your own children, that you were with Big Brothers and Big Sisters during a lot of the 90s, and as a program participant, and then later as a board member. Is that correct?
I did, and I just loved that. I had two little sisters, Tarita and Ashley, and I had so many fun outings with them. I feel like when you do a program like that, you get more out of it than you give. I was able to carve pumpkins again and go for hikes up in Devil's Lake with these wonderful young women, and seeing the world through an 8 or a 9 or 10-year-old eyes is just awesome.
Well, and now they are women. Are they still in Wisconsin or Dane County and being able to help you maybe with your campaign?
I should get in touch with them and ask them. I'll let you know.
Yes. So, and then currently you became a judge, and somebody who I've served on the Governor's Judicial Selection Committee, but you did not go the appointed route, but you did go and run for an open seat. Is that how you won, or how did you become judge in Dane County?
Yes, I ran for an open seat. It was a pretty hotly contested race, and I won by 17 points. And I have been truly honored to serve in that role since my election. Okay.
And but any prior partisan experience before that, partisan politics?
So I grew up, like I said, my mom was a mayor of the town I grew up in. So I have been knocking on doors since I was 7 or 8 years old. Okay. And my mom, just like I'm doing right now, ran for a race where the election was in April. So you campaign all through the winter. So I'm pretty good at getting yard signs into the frozen tundra, and getting all hand warmers and feet warmers, and I know which pens don't freeze. So I've been working on campaigns in one way or another for a long time. All
right, and that was the big difference, unlike Minnesota, and remember our county borders Minnesota up here, so more people are familiar with Minnesota procedures, but there the election is in November, so that judicial elections are right alongside the legislative and partisan elections. So your experience, you don't have necessarily November election experience seeking some type of partisan office.
Oh, me personally, no, I do not.
Okay, all right. I just wanted to clarify that. So, and you never ran for DA?
No, I did not. I was an assistant DA and a deputy DA, but I worked under the elected DA.
Okay, very good. And so, anyway, with lots of experience helping victims and witnesses, anything else that you would like to emphasize when it comes to whether it's your experience, your values, or your energy?
Look, I just think, like I started out saying, that we, the voters in this state, really want to have someone on their Supreme Court who is going to follow the rule of law, who is going to make decisions not based on the outcome that they want, but based on what the law dictates. And I have a long, long track record of doing just that. You can see that in the judicial decisions that I make every day. I have far more experience than either of my opponents when it comes to the court system. I have been involved, I have handled as a judge and as a prosecutor thousands more cases than the two of them combined. I have the broadest experience in this race. As a judge, as a prosecutor, my experience as working in the civil arena, and as a professor of law at the University of Wisconsin Law School. No one else in this race has the depth or the breadth of experience that I bring to it. So I have always been very committed to helping people in Wisconsin. Like I said, I was born and raised here, and my experience, coupled with the values that I have, coupled with the energy that I am bringing, makes me the best candidate and the most qualified candidate in this race.
All right, excellent. Well, with that, we'll Hello and welcome to another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. I'm Jamie Johnson, the legal and government correspondent for Western Wisconsin Journal, and I'm an attorney here in Hudson, Wisconsin with a Lohman Abdo law firm. And today we do have a guest that crosses both the legal and the political categories off, and that is Justice Daniel Kelly. Justice Kelly, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jamie. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Now, Justice Kelly's on for more than one reason, but mainly we have an election coming up this April in which Supreme Court has a position that needs an election for, and I'll have Justice Kelly explain a little bit about that, because Justice Kelly, you were appointed to the Supreme Court back in 2016, is that right?
That's right, 2016. And so the way this works is when an individual is appointed to the Supreme Court, he stands for election in the next spring election in which no other member of the court is already on the ballot. So the rule is there can ever only be one member of the court on the ballot at a time. So in every 10-year cycle, we have 7 members. So in every 10-year cycle, 7 of those years will have Supreme Court elections. And so when I was appointed in 2016, there had already been elections scheduled for 17, 18, and 19. And so the first opportunity I've had to come to the people of Wisconsin and ask for their permission to continue serving them is now. So 2020 is nearly upon us, and here we are.
And this is for a 10-year term, so the winner of this election will be serving until the year 2030. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. Well, let's back up a little bit then. And before you were on the bench, you had other positions, I presume. And so what I would like to know is just tell us a little bit about your background, maybe your family, and some of your qualifications for serving as justice.
Jamie, I appreciate that invitation. That might take up the rest of our half hour together, because there's nothing I like talking about or in my family. But let me start here. So I came to Wisconsin almost 40 years ago. I was born in Santa Barbara. I did most of my growing up years just west of Denver. And I came out here to study at Carroll College. And so I came out one fall, beautiful fall weekend. And Jamie, I got to tell you, I fell in love with the people of Wisconsin the very first day I was here. I'd come out a few days early because I'd never been to Wisconsin before I came out to study at Carroll. Didn't know a soul here, but I heard there was really good fishing, and I love fishing. I grew up fishing the Rockies, and I figured this would be great. Come out fishing in Wisconsin, and so arrived a few days early, and found myself at Nagawicca Lake in Delafield, and it was a fantastic fall weekend. And I know that's true because all of Wisconsin was there to enjoy it with me, and it was crowded. So all the campsites were taken, but there was a young family from Sheboygan Falls, and they were just the kindest, most generous folks. They shared their campsite with me, invited me in, and that evening they invited me to their campfire. They shared their dinner with me, and we got to talking, and soon enough they put their 2 young children to bed, and we were up to the wee hours of the morning talking about all the things that you talk about when you first meet someone that you don't know. And they were just delightful. Next day they took me out sailing, and shared lunch together and spent pretty much the whole weekend together. And Jamie, I came away from that thinking I had just had the most marvelous stroke of luck ever. So the very first people that I meet in Wisconsin are clearly the kindest, warmest, most welcoming people in the entire state. And I thought that's who they were. But as I spent more time here, I realized that although they were remarkable, they were not unique. I found people like them at school and at work and church and pretty much everywhere I went around Wisconsin. Soon enough, I learned that this is really who the people of Wisconsin are. They're the people of the open hand and generous hearts. And so, so I study at Carroll College, and I meet just a wonderful young lady there, and we dated for several years, and we got married 30 years ago now, and we have 5 children, a son and 4 daughters, and they're mostly grown. So my son's all grown up, and I'm just terribly proud of him. And he's married, and so we are grandparent eligible. And so nothing on that front yet. But my wife is starting to talk about that more and more.
Oh, well, I can just tell you, it's wonderful. I have 2, 3, and 1, and it's like starting all over again. So it's great.
Outstanding. Well, I'm glad to hear that. I've, you oftentimes wonder, and we wondered this after we had, went from having 1 child to 2. How am I going to love my second child as much as my first? And as it turns out, I think you kind of you grow, your heart grows as you have more children. And I heard some kind of the same thing when you get to being a grandparent, is that there's just a whole new area of your heart that opens up. And so I'm looking forward to that.
So what part of Wisconsin what part of Wisconsin did you raise your children in?
Yeah, so we're in Waukesha County, and we started out in Milwaukee County, and we lived in a wonderful little neighborhood off of 92nd Street, and just terrific folks there. In fact, our neighbors directly to the north of us became dear friends, and they still are. We moved out to Waukesha County about 15 years ago, but these friends have been friends of the heart, and that never changes. So we've been out here. We wanted to get a little bit more elbow room. We had a wee little house and a growing family, and we started pouring out, I think, and not really quite fitting in that little place. And so we came out this direction to get a little bit more space. And we've loved being out here. It's beautiful. We're on the edge of the Kettle Moraine State Forest, and this is just fantastic. First, actually, when we first moved out here, I was standing on the driveway between our house and the barn, and a beautiful summer night. So there's no street lights out here, and I was looking up at the sky, and you just see all the stars and the Milky Way painted across that black expanse. And I looked around me, and I thought, "Oh my Lord, what have I done? I'm living in the middle of nowhere." And it truly felt that way. And then flash forward about 10 years, I'm standing in the same spot, another beautiful summer evening, and I'm looking around, and I can see my neighbor's house right over there. I don't know, maybe need a little bit more room. So it's kind of fun how perceptions change. Nothing else has changed out here. We don't have new neighbors, but you kind of get used to having a little bit more room around you, and being a little bit more of a rural sensibility.
You mentioned your 5 children are mostly grown. Do you still have any in high school?
We have one. She's 13 years old. So we have, so my daughters are 22, 20, 18, and then 13. So a little bit of a gap between number 4 and number 5. But she's quite the spark plug, and she keeps us energized.
Any of those children go to Carroll College then? They
do. So my daughter Abigail, my daughter Rachel are both at Carroll, and we've been careful, as my folks did for me. They never put their thumb on the scale on what I should choose as my path in life. They left that up to me. They figured, we're going to do the best we can to raise you, and then and part of that part of raising a child is, of course, teaching them how to make wise decisions. And so then when it came time to make my decisions on the path I would take, they just kind of took their hands off to see what I would do. And, we try to do the same thing with our children. And so we didn't put a thumb on the scale on, where they would choose to go to school. But I secretly was kind of happy that they decided to go out to Carroll as well.
So you went to Carroll for undergrad. Where'd you go to law school?
Regent University out in Virginia Beach, Virginia. And here, Virginia Beach is a lovely city. I wouldn't know too much about that because I loved, so I took 2 years between college and law school. And so when I got out there, I couldn't wait to get to my studies. And I loved being in law school. And so I really only knew the path between the apartment and the law school. And that was about it. So I've had a chance to go back and visit Virginia Beach a few times in the last number of years, and truly is a lovely area.
It is, yes. We've vacationed there too, and it's great to get in the water and everything. So after law school, what's your experience? Why don't you tell the folks a little bit about what you did before getting on the bench then?
Yeah, so this is my experience has really turned out in a way that I guess I kind of hoped it would. I have an interest in a whole lot of different things, and I kind of wanted my practice to follow that, to be a broad-based practice, and so it has been. And I've clerked both on the Wisconsin Court of Appeals and the United States Court of Federal Claims Office of Special Masters out in D.C. So I've done that. I've been defense counsel. I've been a special prosecutor. I've spent most of my career in commercial litigation, handling a really, really broad array of cases. I've litigated contract issues, real estate, UCC, professional responsibility, administrative law, constitutional law, and a host of other subjects in the law. And so I've really enjoyed a very broad experience over the 20 years or so before I came to the court. And a lot of that was spent at one of the largest and oldest law firms in the state of Wisconsin. But I've also started my own firm with a good friend, and we built that up, and he's doing a great job with it now. So in the private sector, the public sector, started a business, worked in an established law firm over 100 years old, and just a large number of areas of the law, and it has been a delight. And I found that that's really been actually exceptionally helpful as I've come to the Supreme Court. So one of the responsibilities we have in deciding a case is making sure that the decisions that we come to create as few ripples in the law as possible, right? So our first responsibility is to get to the correct result, the one that is required by the law. But we need to be really careful in the way that we draft our opinions to make sure that they have as few unintended consequences as possible. So when I think about writing an opinion, I have this kind of picture in my mind of a very, very long bookshelf full of the laws of Wisconsin. And we generally take cases because there is an area of the law that has not received a definitive treatment from the Supreme Court before. And so it's a novel question. And so when we're writing the opinion, I envision taking that opinion and putting it on that bookshelf. And I want to make sure that it slips right into the slot where it belongs. And it doesn't disturb anything around it, doesn't knock any of the other books off the shelf, and doesn't create any confusion. So the idea is that we have a clear and precise statement of what the law is, what the law requires in this kind of circumstance, and we don't go changing any of the laws that might be around it. So we make sure that it's precise and clear and to the point. And I think having the broad experience that I do helps me to do that well, because you have a better sense of what the parameters of the law are. If you've had a broad experience.
All right. So, yeah, you kind of slipped into qualifications there, and I appreciate that, moving the interview along. But with that experience, I just wondered, did you have judicial experience prior to Governor Walker appointing you?
I did not.
Okay.
So I went right from private practice to the Supreme Court, but I've been a close watcher of the court and participant in the court for a very long time. So, the cases that I took, oftentimes they were dealt with at the circuit court, the trial court level. But one of the areas in which I concentrated when I was in practice was appellate advocacy. So I've argued, prior to coming to the court, I'd argued several cases before the Wisconsin Supreme Court. I'd argued cases, numerous cases in the courts of appeals and courts of appeals around the country, both state and federal. And so the nature of an appellate tribunal was very familiar to me for a long time before coming to the court. And so there was really not as large of a transition as you might expect, going from doing appellate advocacy in front of the Supreme Court and courts of appeals to switching to the other side of the bench. So all of that appellate experience, I think, it prepared me well to make that transition.
So when you were a litigator, what was your private practice balance between state court and federal court? Was it 70-30, 60-20?
Yeah, it kind of fluctuated over time. So there were periods of time where I was doing virtually nothing but federal cases around the country. And there were times where I was doing virtually nothing but state cases here in Wisconsin. I'd say that over the 20 years or so that I've been practicing in state and federal courts, probably the majority of that has been in state courts in Wisconsin.
And were you a member of any bar organizations besides the Wisconsin State Bar?
Well, there's the Seventh Circuit Bar, the United States Supreme Court Bar, the bars of the different districts that I practiced in. For a while, I was a participant in an Inn of Court, which was a wonderful experience. So one of the let me just back up for just a second. Jamie, I knew when I was in seventh grade that I wanted to be a lawyer, and that never changed. So I've had a love of the law as a thing for a very, very long time. It's not just a job. It's not just a practice. It's not just something to do. I've loved the law and what it represents and the security that it brings to society and the foundation that it creates for people to interact with each other peacefully and prosperously. And just as a foundational matter, I think the rule of law is just exceedingly important. And so when I get an opportunity to get together with other lawyers who have a similar love of the law, who understand that its fundamental nature and role that it plays in our society, and you get together and you talk about the intellectual and the scholastic aspect of the law, I find that delightful. And the Inn of Court was like that. So it was a nice combination of looking at the law as a subject of intellectual inquiry, but also as it is actually in practice. And so, and that's the way that I've interacted with the law ever since I graduated law school. It has been an object that I have an exceptional amount of respect for because of the role that it plays. And I understand how important it is to allowing people to interact with each other peacefully and prosperously. And so it has been a pleasure to pursue that and to strengthen the rule of law in the many different roles that I've had over the years. And now in this role, frankly, Jamie, this has been the honor of a lifetime to serve the people of Wisconsin on their Supreme Court in, again, protecting and advancing the rule of law.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit? You mentioned loving the law and everything and having a legal philosophy. What has been your judicial philosophy, and has it changed since you've become appointed?
Yeah, it's been the same as it has always been. This is the judicial philosophy I've had has actually itself been a matter of deep study for me for the last couple of decades. So, it's this. It's based on the relationship between the people of Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Constitution, and the role of the Supreme Court Justice. So my understanding is that all of the authority all of it, to create and maintain governments belongs to the people of Wisconsin. It all belongs to them. And they don't give it away. They don't sell it. They don't alienate it. They simply lend it to those in government to exercise on their behalf. And the way they express that loan is through the Constitution that they created and maintain even to this day. And so I understand that my responsibility to them is described in the Constitution. And so when I go there to take a look at what our responsibilities are, I see that there's a very clear distinction between what the legislature does and what the judiciary does. We don't make the law. We don't decide what the law ought to be. We don't decide what the law ought not to be. They don't play favorites with the law. All we do is we take that work that the legislature did, we apply it to the case in front of us, so long as it's consistent with the Constitution as it's maintained by the people of Wisconsin, and then we come to our judgment in the case. And it's really, Jamie, it's a pretty humble role. You've got to be comfortable with the idea that we're not there to decide what policy should be for the state of Wisconsin. We're not there to decide what the law ought to be. We are simply there to apply it to the case in front of us as it's written, And if we do that, then we're faithful to the Constitution. And if we're faithful to the Constitution, then we're faithful to the people of Wisconsin. And ultimately, that's the primary responsibility of a Supreme Court justice, is to be responsible to those whose authority he is exercising on their behalf. And so, I like to think of it as, and it's actually true. I've got a whole bunch of bosses, and my responsibility is to be answerable to them. I was at a church service, a Christmas service, almost a year ago, and it wasn't our normal church, our regular church. It was my wife knew the pastor's wife, and they'd invited us out, and invited other office holders to participate with them as well. And after the service, I was in the foyer talking with some of the folks there, and the pastor came up to greet me, and he said, "Justice Kelly, I want to thank you for being out here in the service with us today. It's great to have someone so important be a part of our service." And when he said that about importance, my heart just dropped. I said, "You know what? Can we rewind this conversation just a little bit?" I said, "Pastor, I've often thought that where you rank is inversely proportional to the number of bosses that you have. So the more bosses you have, the lower you rank. Fewer bosses you have, the higher you rank." I said, "Pastor, how many bosses do you have?" And he said, "About one." I said, "Yeah, I've got 6 million. So between you and me, you outrank me a whole heck of a lot." And that's the truth of the matter, Jamie. When I walk into a room and I've got the robe on, I am at the bottom of the heap everywhere I go, because every person that I meet when I'm wearing that robe is one of my bosses. And so my responsibility is to be faithful to them. And so I often put it this way: I'm a servant of the law and a servant of the people. And I think that expresses what my judicial philosophy is. It's a responsibility to them to exercise the authority of the Supreme Court the way that they have asked me to, which is simply applying the law without regard to my personal preferences, but just as the legislature has created it.
And so I understand your judicial philosophy, and I think our audience has a good sense of that now. But a lot of people use the analogy that sometimes judges or justices are also referees, in the sense of it's not that you make the law, but that you have to then interpret how it's to be applied and whether or not it's being applied correctly. Many times the role of the executive branch is to carry out the law, and so you're called upon many times to rule whether or not that power is being abused by another branch of government. So how do you feel about that? Maybe the black robe should be black and white stripes.
That would work too. That's in the analogy to referee. I think that works really well. Chief Justice John Roberts described it as just calling balls and strikes, right?
Right.
And I think that's a great picture, and partly because it describes the humble role that we play, but also because it describes how important it is that we not make the law. So, in a baseball game, the pitcher's got to know where to throw the ball, right?
Right.
So if he wants a strike, he knows where to throw a strike. And if he wants to try to get the batter to swing with something he's never going to connect with, he knows where to throw it. But he's got to depend on the ump, understanding that his role is not to decide where he should have thrown the ball. It's just to decide where did you throw the ball, right? So he says there's the strike zone, and I'm just going to watch the ball and going to see where it comes, and I'm going to call it a strike or not a strike depending on where it's thrown. Now, I'm not going to shift the strike zone around because I think the strike zone ought to be somewhere else. I'm not going to shift it around because I think he should have thrown a strike here instead of a ball. He just takes what comes and he says what it is. And we do the same thing. We don't tell the legislature what laws they should adopt or shouldn't adopt. We just take the laws as they come, and we say, does that comply with the Constitution, or does it not? That is it a strike or is it a ball? And then how does that apply to the case in front of us?
You mentioned the Constitution, and I had asked you off camera prior to start, what are your issues in the campaign? And you really didn't have a whole laundry list, but you started with fidelity to the Constitution, and I wanted you to just talk a little bit about that, please.
Yeah, so it really is that, and it really is that simple. So our responsibility is to apply all of the terms of the Constitution with neither fear nor favor for any party, regardless who that party might be. So it is actually our responsibility not to have issues, which seems a little odd. We hear political debates all the time, and everybody's talking about what their favorite cause is going to be, what constituency they want to serve, what laws they either might like or not like. But then when you get to a judicial election, all the rules change. We don't have causes that we champion on the court. We're not supposed to, at least. We're not supposed to have favorites between the laws. We don't have policies that we think that should be adopted for the state of Wisconsin, and we're not supposed to have any thoughts on what laws or policies ought not to be adopted. Our responsibility is simply fidelity to the Constitution, every single part of it, and we apply that fairly and justly according to the terms of that document as it's been adopted and maintained by the people of Wisconsin. As it turns out, not everyone agrees with that. There are some who believe in this idea of a living constitution, and that the court is supposed to update it from time to time to keep pace with the development in society. And I think that is a complete lack of faithfulness to the Wisconsin Constitution and to the people who maintain it. So the Constitution does need to be updated from time to time, but you know what? The Constitution provides for the way that's done. And as it turns out, what the people of Wisconsin have decided is that it's between them and the legislature to change the Constitution when it needs to be changed. They've not asked us to be any part of that process. Right? So you change the Constitution by passing an amendment in 2 consecutive legislatures and then putting it before the people of Wisconsin for a vote. In no part of that process is the court involved. People of Wisconsin have not asked us to be a part of changing their Constitution. And so for those who would come to the court and try to change the Constitution because they think they have a better understanding of what it ought to be, they're setting themselves at odds with their bosses, with the people of Wisconsin. And I think that's entirely inappropriate.
All right, we just have 1 minute left, and I wanted to give you an opportunity because the other 2 candidates that we've interviewed have mentioned the issue of recusal from certain types of cases for a justice to recuse themselves, and that whether or not the current rule is sufficient. And so I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to that, if you would.
Sure. So recusal is a difficult issue. So essentially, when a justice is unable to fulfill the responsibilities of his office, he has an obligation, an ethical and professional responsibility to recuse himself from considering that case. So here's what our responsibility is. It is to impartially apply the law to the case in front of us. And if there is an outside consideration that interferes with that person's ability to do that, then he can't sit on the case. So we've had recusal rules in the state of Wisconsin for a very long time, and I think they've been serviceable. Is it possible to improve them? That's always possible. And from time to time, people will take a look at that and suggest some changes. We haven't seen any yet that would actually improve the situation without introducing lots of opportunities for mischief. But we're always open to looking for opportunities to ensure that our recusal rules reflect the profound responsibility and obligation that a Supreme Court justice has to faithfully discharge his duties with respect to the Constitution and the people of Wisconsin. And so perhaps those will come up in the future, and we'll take a good hard look at them. And if there is merit and value to them, we'll include that. Because I think it is of fundamental importance that the people of Wisconsin are confident that their justices on the Supreme Court are deciding their cases based on nothing but the law. No outside considerations, just the law.
Well, on that note, we're going to have to end it. The half hour we had kind of flew by. I wanted to give you a chance. Do you have a website that folks could go to learn more about you and your campaign?
I do, and thanks for asking, Jamie. It's justicedanielkelly.com. That's justicedanielkelly.com. And we welcome you there at our website. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Apparently my name's a little too long for that. So on Facebook and Twitter, we are Justice Dan Kelly. So Justice Dan Kelly there, and justicedanielkelly.com for our website. And I'll look forward to, thanks so much for this opportunity, Jamie. I really appreciate this. And I'm looking forward to continuing with this conversation with all my bosses across the state.
Right. Well, very good. And thank you for being on the show. And I look forward to seeing you if you're, the primary, as we're telling voters, is in mid-February, February 17th, I believe. The 18th, all right. The third Tuesday in February. And then the first Tuesday in April is the general election. And hopefully, maybe we'll see you up this way in St. Croix County.
I would look forward to that.
All right. Well, thank you. And I want to thank our viewers for being with us for another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. I'm Jamie Johnson, and keep watching. Hello and welcome to another segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. I'm Jamie Johnson, the government and legal host. And today our guest is a candidate for Congress, Tom Tiffany. Tom, welcome to the show.
Jamie, it's good to be here.
Great to have you. Well, there's been kind of a surprise announced retirement. Sean Duffy is going to be stepping down, and he is not serving out the rest of his term, I understand.
That is correct.
So when is his time effectively done?
So he is no longer the representative for the 7th Congressional District. That ended in September. I think it was September 23rd. It was about a month after he made the announcement at the end of August. Okay. And so that seat is vacant at this time. Yeah.
So we got no voice in Washington here in the 7th District.
That's right. We have no voice in Washington. And I was really hopeful that Governor Evers would call this election earlier than what he has. The primary will be February 18th. And then the general election for this special will be May 12th. So it won't be until May 12th that the 7th Congressional will be represented out in Washington, D.C.
Well, actually, he did announce earlier dates. He had a December primary and a February general, but people, I don't know, complained that was too quick or it conflicted with federal rules or something.
Yeah, there was a conflict with federal law for overseas voters, and so they had to correct that. And so anyhow, those dates are set now, and we're running.
Yep, February 18 primary, which coincides with the spring primary for the nonpartisan elections.
That is correct.
But this will be a partisan. And if there's a primary, I should say, because you need 2 candidates with sufficient signatures, correct?
That is right.
What's your deadline for getting signatures in?
I think the deadline is December 2nd. I have to double check that. We're telling everybody the end of November, so we make sure we get them in. But you have to get 2,000 signatures for a congressional seat.
Where do those get turned in at?
I believe they get turned into the Elections Commission
Here in Wisconsin.
Here in Wisconsin.
Yeah,
yes.
you don't have to fly to Washington, D.C.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I better double check that, but I think that's correct. We're just working on getting the signatures.
So we should get into your qualifications and background. Obviously, this is your first time for federal office, correct?
That is correct.
But you are currently serving in state office.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk about my background a
Okay,
little bit.
yeah.
It's great to be back in western Wisconsin. I grew up over here. Grew up on a dairy farm just north of Elmwood.
Okay.
5 brothers, 2 sisters. Used to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and feed the calves as a 10-year-old, and Mom and Dad taught us the value of hard work and, more importantly, teamwork. And I went on to college at UW River Falls. Got an agricultural degree there. Spent a number of years in southern Minnesota, and then 30 years ago I moved up to Minocqua, and that's where I met my wife Chris, and we owned Wilderness Cruises. It's a dinner and excursion boat on the Willow Flowage. We owned and operated that for 20 years. I'm also the dam tender on the Willow Flowage.
Okay.
I'm a dam man, Jamie.
Yeah.
And I've been doing that for 28 years, and my wife and I are just like a lot of families across Wisconsin. We work 2 and 3 jobs to make ends meet. I have 3 daughters, Carlin, Lexi, and Catherine. Catherine is in high school yet. Carlin and Lexi are in college. And I've served in a number of ways locally. Been on the local Chamber of Commerce board in Minocqua, served on the Oneida County Economic Development Commission, and served 2 terms on our town board, and currently serving in the state legislature, just finishing my 2nd term in the state Senate.
Okay. So were you in the Assembly before you were in the Senate?
Yes, I served 2 years in the Assembly.
Okay. All right. Now, backing up, you mentioned about just north of Elmwood, so that was like right near the Dunn County-Pierce County border?
That's right.
And you mentioned UW River Falls, so what years would you have been there?
So I was there 76 through 80. Graduated in 1980.
Okay.
And agricultural economics. And in fact, a professor at UW River Falls left a great impression on me that still guides me in regards to economic policy. And that was Glenn Potts, who ran the economics department. He turned me on to Milton Friedman and the Chicago School of Economics. And you know how you get great teachers that really motivate you and leave an impression. He was one that did for me.
Okay, well, I think we might hear about Milton Friedman, or at least economics, as we get into your areas of focus.
Yeah, for sure.
So your background, you know, you said 6 a.m. getting up. We got up at 5 a.m. to milk the cows, but it was...
Maybe I was a late riser.
Yeah, but no, if you had a lot of siblings, so the farm was the place to raise kids, especially 60s and 70s. So anyway, you have 3 daughters, and you said some were in school. Has anybody graduated from college then?
Unfortunately, no. We're still paying for college, but Carlin's going to be done in a year here. So
well, we made it through 3 through college. So but anyway, so and the offices, you said that you're finishing your 2nd term in the Senate. So you've been in state office, what, 5-6 years?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. And before that, you were on the town board then?
Yep.
Not simultaneously, like with the Assembly?
There was a brief overlap in the Assembly.
Okay.
Yeah, there was a brief overlap.
And any partisan office prior to, 5 years ago?
No.
Okay.
Nope.
And we should say you're a member of the Republican Party and have run on the Republican Party all along?
Yes, yes, that is correct.
All right. Well, let's talk about, we got your qualifications and your background. Now, what's your motivation for running? If you are working 2-3 jobs and so forth, why do you want to be, first you were in Madison, now why would you want to go to Washington?
Yeah, I think it's that background. So I think about my daughters, and are they going to have the same freedoms and opportunity that we've had growing up? And I think that's in question at this point. I think our way of life, it's looking at the way things are going in Washington, D.C. right now. People are talking about changing our way of life. I mean, I take a look at like healthcare. There's a proposal out there to eliminate health insurance. The major candidates, presidential candidates, are talking about eliminating private health insurance. Tens of millions of people are dependent on that.
Those are some of the ones on the farthest left they're talking about. Right.
There's a number of them that have put forth proposals like that. There's also a proposal in Congress to end animal agriculture. I mean, my gosh, we are America's dairy land, and they want to get rid of cows. And when I tell people that, they're like, are you serious? Is that really, that proposal really been made? It has been made. And what is happening is there's an open embrace by some out in Congress of socialism. Socialism has never worked, and it will not work in the future. And so I want to protect that way of life. I want to fight for our freedoms out in Washington, D.C., so that my daughters, the next generation, and the generations to follow, that they have the same freedoms that we've had in this country.
Okay. So that's your motivation. What's your campaign theme?
Freedom. It's to give people freedom and opportunity. I mean, I'll give you a quick example. This is a really pretty simple issue, and it's small in the scheme of things, but I think it really highlights what's going on in Washington, D.C. A number of years ago, there was Michelle Obama advanced a proposal to change how school lunches are provided for schools across America. I have had local cooks seek me out from schools up in our area and say, Tom, this is not working. We are throwing away most of the food, and the kids aren't getting the dietary requirements that they should have. This is the heavy hand of the federal government that is intruding into what should be local decisions. It's those type of things that are really that are harming our country. And if there's something that I want to work on, it is that, to bring control back to the local level, because it's not working as with all the mandates that we have at this point.
Any other examples besides school lunches of mandates that you would like to see rolled back?
Oh yeah, there's if we talk about legislation here, there's something that I want to propose as soon as I get out to Washington, D.C., and that's to implement the REINS Act. The REINS Act would put controls on the mandates that are being proposed by bureaucrats out in Washington, D.C. Quick example, there was a proposal for something called Boiler Act a number of years ago that would apply to industrial companies. There's a paper mill in Rhinelander, Wisconsin, that had to build a $13 million smokestack in order to ostensibly reduce the amount of emissions that they give from that paper mill. They spent the $13 million, they built the stack. Do you know how much emissions were reduced? Zero. Nothing. It's those type of mandates that we're getting from the federal level that have no benefit for society that we need to rein in. And that happened as a result of not a law from Congress, but just by a rule change by bureaucrats out in Washington, D.C. We need to stop that type of thing, because you have costs like this to a paper mill that are having no benefit to our society, no benefit to the people of the state of Wisconsin. We really need to rein that in.
Okay. So moving on then to issues. You mentioned the campaign theme of freedom, and I could draw some correlation with various issues, but what do you see are the 3 or 4 main areas of focus that you think this election is going to be about?
I think things that are really important at this point include the deficit. I mean, that's why I originally ran. I mean, I've been a small business owner my whole life and dedicated my life to that, owning, operating businesses. And I came into the legislature as a citizen legislator to change what was happening in Wisconsin. We had a $3 billion deficit. That's gone now. And we have surpluses in Wisconsin. We need to do the same thing at the federal level. The deficit is out of control. I think we need to deal with health care. There's a proposal currently to have a takeover of the healthcare system at the federal level. That is the wrong way to go. Healthcare is an individual decision. We need to bring control back to the local and state level and have solutions come from individuals themselves, because our healthcare needs are all individual. We're not the same. And if we allow individualized decisions that happen at the local level, or at the federal level, or excuse me, at the state level, we're going to get much better solutions than this cookie cutter approach, one size fits all approach that would happen at the federal level. Another thing that I'd work on is the USMCA, the trade agreement that is before Congress currently. Our farmers are depending on that. And it is really unfortunate at this point that Speaker Pelosi has not taken up this issue. And if I go out to Washington, D.C., I will press every day to get USMCA before the Congress and get a vote on that. It's too important for our farmers to allow it to languish.
Okay. So you mentioned deficit, healthcare, trade, any others?
Yeah, there's a couple other things that I think are really fundamental, and they're constitutional provisions that we need to make sure that we protect. And that is the freedom of speech. The First Amendment to the Constitution was put in place to protect political speech. The founders put that in place because they wanted to have open, honest discourse by whoever wanted to participate in the public square. We're seeing in universities across the country the squelching of political speech. We have people that are being denied their ability to be able to share their views within our universities. That's really a travesty. We're seeing groups like Antifa that are attacking people when they're out in the public square and they just want to share their political beliefs. We need to restore that good, robust, honest public discourse for political free speech, because our country was built on that. The other thing is, I will protect the Second Amendment to the Constitution. I think that is also one of the bedrocks of our Constitution.
Okay. And what does that mean, to protect the Second Amendment?
I think you see proposals that, take a look at the state of Wisconsin here. Governor Evers is talking about universal background checks, which is code word for gun registration. And I do not think that we should move in that direction. Now, we're all concerned about the mass shootings that have been going on. And we've done something. I've certainly voted for legislation that has protected our schools, additional money in this budget for mental health. Things like that can be done, but to just take away legal, law-abiding gun owners, to take away their guns or to deny their rights is not the route to go.
But not to push back too hard, but if you get rid of background checks, then how do you know if they're legal, law-abiding people that are getting the guns?
We have a really good system at the federal level called NICS that does those background checks at this point. And now, if somebody brought forth a proposal that would make the NICS process work more effectively, I'm open to listening to that. But
So you're not against background checks, just...
No, that's not what I said.
Okay.
I said the NICS system of doing background checks has worked at the federal level, and I think we should continue to use that process of the NICS background.
Yeah, because I thought like background checks, that's pretty... Even gun owners agree kind of that some background checks need to be done.
Yes, and I think the question is appropriate that you're putting out there. So yes, the NICS system of background checks does work.
Right.
Gun registration is not necessary.
Okay. Well, I have to go back to your first issue, because the deficit is something that I've talked about 4 presidents ago and continue. What would you propose? Because, with the current administration, we've seen the deficit more than triple. So how would we bring that down?
I think you reduce the size of the federal government. First of all, I think there's a lot of people that are filling positions out in Washington, D.C. that are really not doing something that's effective for the taxpayers of Wisconsin or for the country. I think you start there with unnecessary positions. And so
is that across all avenues of government, as far as this general size of the federal government you think needs to be reduced?
Yeah, we need to reduce the size of the federal government. And so how I equate it is that, how do you eat an elephant? Mm-hmm. A bite at a time. We had a $3 billion deficit here in Wisconsin. Our finances were a mess back in 2010 when I chose to run for office. And that was one of the main reasons that I ran, is to fix that mess. And I told people, you will not do this in one budget. It's going to take a series of budgets. 5 budgets later, we now have surpluses. We have the largest rainy day fund in the history of the state. We need to take those same ideas and principles to the federal level. It will not turn around immediately, but we need to begin to take those bites out of the elephant in order to turn this around over the next decade or two.
Would you be willing to work with deficit hawks who happen to have a D behind their name?
Oh, for sure. For sure.
And because there could be ideas on both sides of the aisle to reduce deficits. And I happen to think, there was a time when both sides of the aisle worked together and we had a surplus 20 years ago. And now that surplus is gone. The other...
and I don't pretend that this will be easy. That deficit is so large at this point, it will really be a challenge. But
well, there's some people who have, resisted, talk about deficits, actually, taking it right out of the top 3-4 issues where you have placed it. And they say, well, we can't do those things because that means cutting Social Security or Medicare or so forth. Now, obviously, Medicare is part of the budget, but what about the notion of a Social Security lockbox and, letting Social Security be self-funded so that government's not dipping into it when there is a surplus in the Social Security side?
I guess I'd have to study that question a little bit more to get you a precise answer in regards to that. I would say this: Social Security and Medicare are a promise that we've made to people who have paid into that, and we need to make sure that that they receive that benefit that they paid for.
Right. But we saw, Medicare Part D was created without any way of paying for it, and I guess that's how you get to the elephant. You get from the skinny bean to something that's much larger by adding mandates that aren't getting funded.
Yeah.
Solutions to healthcare then, without going the cookie cutter route or totally government funded. Do you see just kind of going back to the pre-Obamacare days of just let people who can afford it get it and those who can't don't? Or how would you navigate that? Because once the government provides a benefit, it's very hard to take it back.
That is accurate. I think if you look at what is being proposed currently, and as you said, people on the left are calling for a federal-run system, Medicare for all. So there's concerns there because, first of all, it will explode the deficit and probably bankrupt the country. And so that's a great concern for people who currently are on Medicare. We want to make sure that they continue to get that benefit. That endangers that benefit by expanding it to Medicare for all. So we should not do it for that reason. But I think the solutions lie at the state and local level. I just take a look at some of the things that are happening with like local businesses and others. For example, when I did the rollout for my campaign, we went to an old line manufacturing business in Wausau that Merrill Steel, and they brought an in-house clinic in a year ago. And they have their own mobile unit that they do house calls for their employees as well as their employees' dependents. They found a way to get control of their healthcare costs by doing it locally. I think about direct primary care, where you have local clinics where you have doctors who are so frustrated with the system and everything that's between them and the patient, whether it's the government, whether it's insurance companies, whatever it may be, they want to just have a relationship, doctor and patient. We're seeing those clinics sprout up across Wisconsin. We have one, there's one up in the Rhinelander area. And people can get their primary care for $50 to $75 a month. And that's another good solution. Association health plans, where perhaps you're a business that you can't be self-funded and be able to do like Merrill Steel does, but allow local small businesses to pool their resources and form an association health plan, perhaps through a chamber of commerce, perhaps through like-minded people. I talked to a veterinarian in the district who said that type of thing has been proposed by a national veterinarians group. We should allow local approaches to this healthcare concern, and I think people will find affordable ways in which to be able to get to affordable healthcare. Because for most people, what I'm hearing from them is they have pretty good access to healthcare, It's not perfect, but they have pretty good access. It's affordability that is the concern. And then I believe there's also a role for the state. I mean, we have the Medicaid program, Badger Care, here in Wisconsin. About 1 million people are covered by that. I think you have to allow a variety of ways at the state and local level for people to be able to achieve affordability for health care, access to health care. And it will happen here at the local level, at the state level. At the federal level, you end up with this one-size-fits-all program that does not distinguish between individualized needs that we have.
Okay. So those are some good ideas for addressing those issues. What kind of legislation, if elected in May, what legislation would you propose in those first 6 months you'd be in Congress?
Yeah, I'd probably do something along the lines of healthcare to allow greater options at the local level. I mean, I've seen it, how if we allow greater freedom for people at the state and local level, you're going to get better solutions for affordable healthcare. I alluded to the REINS Act before. Controlling these mandates that are coming from the federal level, in particular when there's no legislation passed, but a bureaucrat says, we're going to change this administrative rule. And that has the force of law. And you end up with the $13 million smokestack that has no benefit for society. Those type of things happen regularly coming from our federal government. It's time to pass something like the REINS Act to rein in our federal government. Another thing that I would propose right away is to delist the wolf. A very big problem in northern and central Wisconsin. And 26 scientists, wildlife scientists, signed a document about 5-6 years ago calling for the federal government to delist the wolf. It is time to do it. Science says that the wolf has recovered. It's time to delist the wolf. I would also work on infrastructure issues, transportation, those type of things, because we need to make sure that we have a good infrastructure for the 21st century. You know, whether it's sewer and water, roads, ports, airports. I mean, we have a major port in the 7th Congressional District up in Superior. Our airports. We need to make sure that that infrastructure is being kept up to date. Because if you look at California right now, they're having rolling blackouts as a result of their utility out there has not made the investments necessary to make sure that their system is prepared for what is going on there. We need to make sure that when people turn on the lights, turn on their faucet, flush their toilets, want to go out of a major airport or go out of any airport, that those are all functioning well. And I think that's something that we need to make sure we're making the investments in, is that infrastructure.
Okay. Before I ask the last couple questions, I just noticed not in your areas of focus are necessarily upper legislation is anything having to do with immigration. And I know we're not a border state in the sense of, I mean, we're closer to Canada than Mexico, but we've heard a lot of, the focus being on build the wall, don't build the wall. But what's your position on immigration? I happen to be of the mind that I think neither side really wants to do anything, and they'd rather see it be the political football it is, instead of working with having both sides of the aisle work on something. They had the Gang of Eight, which is bipartisan, had a solution worked out, and that all got scuttled by people who were on the far ends of each of the spectrum. So where are you at on that?
It's a critical issue. Now, first of all, that is a fundamental job of the federal government, is to make sure and protect our borders, secure our borders, know who is coming in and out of our country. And that's something that I think it's a very important issue, and we need to solve that. And it's part of what's disheartening out in Washington, D.C. right now, when all you hear about is the impeachment inquiry. This is an issue that should be worked on so that we get a system of immigration that we know who's going in and out of our country, and then have a immigration system that works for America, including bringing people in who pass muster, who can meet our laws, that can come in and work in the United States, because we have employers that need people to be able to work. I mean, I'm sure you hear it as much as I do. Employers need people to be able to do these jobs here in America, but it has to be done in a legal fashion. I'm hopeful, and this is something I'm certainly willing to work on if I'm out in Washington, D.C., to be able to put that system in place. But we do have to have secure borders so we know who goes in and out of our country. We need to make sure that we're not letting bad guys into the country. People with criminal histories, we should know who's coming in and out of our country because there are good people. I mean, we're a nation of immigrants. And we should have a reasonable system of legal immigration, but the border does have to be secured to do that.
Well, and you use the I word, not immigration and not infrastructure, but neither of those are being addressed because of a third I issue, and that's this impeachment talk. And I break it up into three areas because, first of all, we're in a kind of a gray area here of an impeachment inquiry without having any vote been taken. And then there's one issue about whether you, and I'll let you answer, is whether you believe that there ought to be an impeachment inquiry. And then second is whether there ought to be impeachment, which we haven't heard all the facts yet. And then third would be whether or not the president ought to be removed from office. And those are three totally separate questions. So where do you stand on the first as to whether or not there ought to be an impeachment inquiry?
There should not be an impeachment inquiry. There have been no actions taken that warrant impeachment. It is irresponsible what Speaker Pelosi is doing right now to call this impeachment inquiry. I mean, look at what's going on here. Ever since the election of November of 2016, there was immediate talk of impeaching President Trump. And we see this drumbeat month after month. And now we get a hearing, which was a closed hearing, that the public could not see. It's just irresponsible that this has been conducted in the manner that it has. And I equate it to Wisconsin here. If you look back 6-7 years ago when we had the recalls, that was kind of an impeachment where people disagreed with the policy decisions being made in Madison. So people said, we got to recall these people. No, those were policy differences that should have been settled at the ballot box. The impeachment inquiry is, I mean, we saw that with Sheila Harsdorf, we saw it with Governor Walker. And the impeachment inquiry is just like that. These are policy differences. Settle them at the ballot box in November of 2020. It is terrible what has gone on here. And also, this impeachment process is coming to fruition much more rapidly than any impeachment inquiry in the history of our country. Being done behind closed doors, that is just flat out wrong. I stand against this impeachment inquiry, and it's just reckless what is going on here.
Well, would you advocate for a vote then for whether or not it would continue? Isn't that what they're going to do tomorrow on Thursday, maybe the 31st? They've scheduled a vote on whether or not the impeachment inquiry ought to be continued.
Yeah, well, first of all, if that vote happened and I was there, I would vote against it. But they should drop the impeachment inquiry. They don't have a rationale to defend impeaching President Trump. It is not there. These are policy differences that they have with the president. And, I mean, let's be honest what's happening here. They're trying to play out the string with President Trump and prevent him from implementing his agenda because it's been successful. I mean, one of the things that we haven't talked about here is the economy. The economy is doing so well because President Trump has accomplished two of his goals. One was the Trump tax cuts, which has really turbocharged our economy here, both in Wisconsin and around the country. And the other thing is where he's proposed eliminating 2 regulations for every regulation that's put in place. That has gotten rid of the mandate that caused the $13 million smokestack in Rhinelander. And so those things have been so successful. They know they cannot run against President Trump with such a strong economy, so they're trying to find other ways to distract the public. I believe that's what's going on. The impeachment witch hunt needs to stop.
All right. Well, I've been told we're out of time. I appreciate you coming on the show. Thank you for coming on. And remind folks the primary is February 18th, should there be a primary for either party. And then the general is May 12th. And so maybe we'll have you back in that interim again.
Yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to people here on the in western Wisconsin, and it's always good to be back to the old stomping grounds.
Well, again, thanks for being on the show, and thank you for watching a segment of Western Wisconsin Journal. I'm Jamie Johnson. Keep watching.